So in this little lecture, we're going to be looking at the theory of justice of John Rawls, a 20th century philosopher. His famous book, A Theory of Justice, was published in the 1970s and established a new way of thinking about how social contract theory could be used to elucidate a theory of justice as a type of fairness involved in that implicit social contract. The basic idea of Rawls's theory of justice was an old idea that philosophers like David Hume, the 18th century empiricist, had come up with, or Adam Smith with his idea of the impartial spectator. They had realized that our sentiments about a thing are often determined by our interest. And just as a scientist attempts to be objective and put aside their personal interest and their self-interest, so the opinion of a person in the original position should be objective in that same way too, should be in some way detached from their eventual position in their society. So Rawls called this the veil of ignorance. He asked that we imagine how we would like to order our society and imagine that we would make our choices, our social contract, so to speak, behind a veil of ignorance. We wouldn't know whether we would be rich or poor. We wouldn't know whether we would be healthy or in need of health care. We wouldn't know if we would be able-bodied or have various different physical impairments. We wouldn't know our position in the society. So he thinks that the type of distribution of wealth and liberty and goods in the society would be most fair if we would rationally choose it in our self-interest, if we were behind the veil of ignorance, if we didn't know who in the eventual ordering in that society, what role and what place we would play in it. So Rawls thinks that there are two different conditions that must be met. And they're called the principle of equality and then the principle of difference. And he thinks that the inequalities must be the benefit of the least well off, and that there has to be equal opportunity for all to gain from the advantages of treating people unequally. So you can watch the little video in the next slide that explains Rawls's veil of ignorance. So again, the idea is going to be that you won't know if you're going to be a nobleman, a prince, a merchant, or a slave. You won't know whether you're going to be Jeff Bezos or a homeless person in the street. You won't know if you're blind or able-bodied. You won't know if you're really smart or not so smart at all. And from that original position, Rawls thinks that rational self-interest would require that you choose these two different principles. And they have various different names. You can see sometimes they're called the liberty principle and the difference principle, sometimes the equality principle and the difference principle. So the first principle is that it has to do with the distribution of liberties. And Rawls thinks that it would be in our self-interest to choose the greatest amount of liberty that's compatible with equal liberty for all. So everyone should have equal liberty and should have the greatest amount of liberty that's compatible with equal liberty for all. And that's normally how we think about liberties. You should have right to speech as long as it doesn't involve abrogating somebody else's right to speak. You should have a right to live your life the way you want to as long as it doesn't interfere with somebody else's right to live their life the way that they want to. So less people disagree with the equality principle. The second principle, the difference principle, says that when we look about, which is by far the more influential of Rawls's, since it deals with distributive justice, how to distribute and assign the benefits and burdens to a member of a society. He says that they have to assign them in a way that benefits everyone. And that means that these two things have to be true. There has to be equal opportunity for everyone to gain from the advantages of treating people unequally. So if we're going to have some people be rich and some people be poor, if we're going to allow that different distribution, if we're going to allow some people to be doctors and other people not to be doctors, there at least has to be equal opportunity for everyone to gain from those advantages of treating people unequally. And most importantly, that any inequalities in the distribution of goods have to be for the benefit of everyone, which means they must benefit the least well off in the society. So, whereas the equality principle says liberty has to be distributed equally, um, and be the most liberty compatible with equal liberty for everyone. The difference principle talks about the ways in which the distribution of wealth and benefits and burdens can be unequal. They can be unequal as long as there's equal opportunity to the benefits for everyone. And whatever inequalities there are have to be better for everyone. Sometimes this is the basic idea behind capitalism, that a rising tide lifts all boats. So that even if we allow certain inequalities of wealth to arrive or to be exist, that even the least well-off person will still be better off. So we'll agree only with those inequalities that make it better for the least well-off person. Even though there's inequalities, allowing those inequalities makes the least well-off person richer. So it would be rational from behind the veil of ignorance, when you don't know if you're going to be a rich person or the poorest person, to accept only those inequalities, Rawls says, which would make everyone better off. So people often like to point out that despite the fact that capitalism allows great inequalities, the poorest person now is still much, much better off than they were in medieval Europe. The poorest person now in America still has a TV, probably still owns 10 or 15 different outfits, eats well, eats better than the king did in the 14th century, has running water, we hope. So the inequalities that allow for the vast differences in wealth in our society, Rawls would say, are justified by the fact that even the least well-off person in our society is still much, much better off than they would be if there were not the inequalities of wealth that capitalism allows and benefits from. So the inequalities that are chosen have to be those that benefit the worst off, is the main idea of Rawls's distributive justice theory. So Rawls is applying a view of what's rational and in our self-interest from the original position. And he thinks that in the original position, we would rationally choose in our own self-interest to make ourselves safe in that way. We're only allowing inequalities that will be better off from the worst person. So we're, in some sense, we're kind of using what's called the maxi-min principle, which is sort of a play it safe maxim. We're maximizing the minimum case. We're maximizing the worst thing that could happen. So we're allowing behind the veil of ignorance, we don't know. We might turn out to be Jeff Bezos and the richest person in the world. We might be the poorest person in the world. But he's saying it would be rational for us behind the veil of ignorance, since we don't know which we're going to be, for us to choose to play it safe. Maybe you'll disagree. Maybe you think sometimes we will gamble for a higher payoff. Maybe you will choose, maybe you think it might be rational to choose a distribution where 85% are really, really well off and 15% are miserable, gambling on the possibility that you won't be among those 15%. But Rawls thinks that from the original position, we would play it safe, and it would be rational to maximize your self-interest by using that maxi-min principle. So you can see there that people will disagree about whether you should sometimes gamble in your rational self-interest, whether it might be better to use the expected value theory that we talked about, and consider, what would be the probability with different forms of society of having how many people in each level of society, and what arrangement would maximize the amount of happiness you got, times the probability of you being in each of those levels. Or maybe you would just find, the mode. What are the most probable cases? What are you most likely to end up in from behind the veil of ignorance, and just maximize those most probable cases, not worrying about a few outliers on the top or the bottom. So there's disagreements in contemporary economics and contemporary political theory about what really is the most rational way of choosing from behind the veil of ignorance. Um, Rawls thought it was this difference principle, to play it safe and maximize, accept only inequalities that will maximize the worst off person, will benefit them, and justify the inequality, because no matter where you end up, you'll still be better if you choose a society that allows that inequality. But the big idea of Rawls's theory is that justice involves choosing rational self-interest from behind the original position, and having a social contract that obeys those rational choices of self-interest. Um, there are some interesting objections in contemporary economic theory and in what's called game theory, that deal with some limitations of the rationality of self-interest. Cases where it seems merely acting in your rational self-interest and maximizing them the way that Rawls suggests might not turn out to make it better for you or make it better for the whole. We've already considered one, the lifeboat. Um, you might think that we've already seen that you might think that the rational thing to do in the lifeboat would be to throw one or two people off in order to save everyone. That might maximize the expected value and maximize the greatest good for the greatest number. You can see that Rawls would disagree with lifeboat ethics. He would say we would only distribute those burdens in ways that make everyone better off, even the two poor souls that get thrown off. So his maximizing or play it safe version of self-interested rationality solves that problem. Garrett Hardin, who wrote the article that you're reading on lifeboat ethics, also considered another case where limited common resources make it so that rational self-interest turns out to not give you the best possible outcome. Even though looks like you're acting rationally to protect your own interests, actually you end up making it worse for everyone. The Commons was originally a little place in a walled town, where people in the city who were right on top of each other could have sheep and cows and chickens, and could have a common area where they could graze their sheep or graze their cows or let their chickens run. And they would share that in common, since there was only limited space within the walled town. That's what Boston Commons originally was. And it would be in your interest to allow as many of your cows or pigs or chickens to graze in the commons as possible, since you get it for free and you don't have to tend it the way you have to tend your own fields, or you wouldn't have to rent fields outside of the town. But of course, what will happen if everybody does that, if everybody acts in their own individual self-interest? Well, then there will be so many cows grazing the commons that the commons will be ruined, and no one will have any free grazing for their animals, and they'll all starve. Um, that's just true of many different types of resources. It may be to our individual advantage to dump our litter or to pollute the water, or to put our exhaust or our methane gas into the atmosphere. But when we deplete those resources or ruin the environment, everyone will suffer in a much worse way. So this is a basic problem, not just with Rawls's theory and utilitarianism, but with any society where people act in their rational self-interest. People's rational self-interest seems to be limited in that way, that if you act blinded by just your individual view of the situation, you'll ignore the way in which it's possible that limited resources become depleted and make it worse for everybody. There's another whole class of cases that economists and mathematicians have looked at where rational self-interest seems to fail. And this is what's called the prisoner's dilemma. The prisoner's dilemma is called that because the most common example of it, it doesn't always have to involve prisoners. It's a general case where people's rationality in choosing their own good causes them to act irrationally and ignore common goods that would benefit them even more. But in the clearest example with the prisoners, we imagine that two buddies who did a crime are each caught and put in jail and put in separate rooms, hoping that they'll confess and give the other person in. Um, and if one of them confesses and the other person doesn't, the person who confesses will get off, and the person who they turn in and turn state's evidence against will get 20 years. And that will happen if they refuse to confess and the other person turns them in. So the best result for each of them is if they don't give in, or if they do turn in their friend and the other person remains silent and remains loyal. It's better for them to opt out and be disloyal while the other person remains loyal. If they both are disloyal and turn the other in, then they'll both get 5 years each, which is much worse. But if they remain silent and they refuse to turn each other in, then each one will get just 1 year apiece. This is obviously the best choice for the common good. But their own self-interest will lead them, since if they, even though they might realize this might be best for them, they might feel that they need to protect themselves. If they're like Rawls and don't know whether they're going to be the person that tattles or the person that stays strong, it will be in their rational interest to always give the other person in. So these choices will be the most common that people will make, even though they're the worst for everyone. Or this might be the position that eventually most prisoners would take. And this isn't anywhere near as good. This was called the Nash equilibrium, called after John Nash, a game theorist who was made famous in the movie A Beautiful Mind. And it pointed out the fact that human reason, when acting in its self-interest, will tend towards an equilibrium that isn't the best at all, that isn't at all better for them. If there was some way that they could pass a note or cooperate or figure out what the other person was doing and trust them, it would obviously be better for them to both stay strong. So this is the case in lots of social situations. On eBay, it's best off for each person individually to cheat the other person and just keep their money, or to refuse to send, to refuse to pay and hope the other person sends the package to you. And in fact, that would be what would happen. You'd have a completely untrustworthy system unless there was some social system set up, like feedback, to ensure cooperation and stop people from acting just in their rational self-interest, get people to somehow trust each other. You can watch this little video on the prisoner's dilemma. So Rawls's theory suggests that the best form of distributive justice would be the social contract we'd implicitly agree to if we chose through rational self-interest behind a veil of ignorance, not knowing who we were going to be. But various different objections, not just to Rawls's theory, but to utilitarianism in general, suggest that sometimes rational self-interest doesn't lead us to the best position. The tragedy of the commons suggested that in the case of limited resources, acting in our self-interest will lead us to pollute and deplete common resources in a way that will be worse for all of us, even though we might think it's in our rational self-interest. And the prisoner's dilemma is an even more fundamental problem. that will tend to opt out and to betray the common good, because it will always be rational for ourselves to do that if we don't know what other people are going to do. This is like Singer's concern with the fair share argument. If you don't know what other people are going to do, it might be rational for you to do less until you see what other people are going to do. The prisoner's dilemma suggests that your rational self-interest leads you to always opt out of cooperation and always betray the common good, unless there's some system of trust, some social organization that allows us to know what other people are doing and to trust in the goodwill of other people around us, like the feedback system in eBay. Eventually, social systems will break down as rational interest leads us to that terrible Nash equilibrium instead of to the common good. So we can talk about this during our debate, but it should be easy to see how Rawls would be applied to disability or healthcare or any of the debates we've had so far by asking how much tax would you be willing to pay, how much uh, income would we be willing to give up for healthcare or for disability if you didn't know whether you were going to be rich and healthy or whether you were going to be poor and disabled and unhealthy. What would be rational for you to choose if you didn't know from behind the veil of ignorance what position you were going to have? The thing that you would choose, the most rational choice you would choose, Rawls say, would be the just thing to do with respect to how to allocate the benefits and costs of healthcare or disability or any public good.